Good morning and welcome to Developing Your SED Compliant Facilities Emergency Plan. This morning's session is brought to you by our diamond sponsor, NYS. We're grateful for their generous support and hope you'll visit them in the virtual exhibit hall. Our speaker today is Peter LaDuca, Executive Manager, Health and Safety Training and Information Service for Nassau BOCES. Mr. LaDuca is the Executive Manager of the Nassau BOCES Health and Safety Training and Information Service. He established this program over 30 years ago and currently works with all 56 Nassau County school districts. The purpose of the Health and Safety Service is to help school districts respond to the ever-increasing requirements of health and safety issues which impact them. Some of the current issues include emergency planning, violence prevention, indoor air quality, and chemical safety. Mr. LaDuca has been certified by the National School Safety Center as a violence prevention leader and by the New York State Education Department as a violence prevention trainer. Mr. LaDuca works closely with all regulatory agencies, including Homeland Security, United States Department of Education, Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, Department of Environmental Conservation, New York State Education Department, Nassau County Department of Health, Nassau County Police Department, and the Office of Emergency Management. Mr. LaDuca has been awarded both a New York State Environmental Stewardship for reducing the use of pesticides in schools and a United States EPA Environmental Quality Award for implementing indoor air quality improvement strategies in schools. Peter, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. I think we could advance this slide. And just advance it one more. Okay, we're good to go. Again, thank you. It's really my privilege to be here. I've had the really distinct honor of working with SFMI since its inception. I've been doing this for over 15 years. Usually I'd be traveling to Albany, Saratoga, or somewhere upstate to deliver this kind of session. So this is a little bit unique because we're in unique times. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the unique times and how that impacts specifically the school safety plans that we're all required to develop. I'd like to begin by just mentioning, I'm sure you're feeling this the same way that I am. There are so many different regulations coming at us right now, so much different guidance. We have guidance coming at us from CDC, we have guidance coming from the State Education Department, the State Health Department, the local health departments, OSHA. It's really coming at us from all directions. And the truth of the matter is, although I really pride myself on the fact that we have the latest information and are able to relate that information to schools and update them in a timely manner, if it's becoming difficult for me to do that, I know it's becoming even more difficult for you. When you additionally consider that a lot of the guidance that's coming down is in conflict. Some of the guidance from the State Education Department is in direct conflict with guidance from the State Health Department. So this is getting difficult to sort through. And when you have the opportunity to speak to some of the agencies, such as the State Education Department, State Health Department, to try to resolve some of these conflicts, it actually becomes even a little more confusing. It doesn't seem like you can really get a straight answer. But hopefully by the end of today's session, we will be able to answer a lot of the questions that have been asked, certainly down here on Long Island and I believe throughout the state. Next slide. So these are things I plan on covering today. We have a really limited amount of time, but I want to talk to you very briefly about the required safety plans. This should be nothing new to you, but I believe we need to do a quick review in order to really understand some of the changes that are going to take place. The regulatory requirements, we're going to quickly go over. The compliance dates, which once again, you should be familiar with already. But just yesterday, I had a business official from the school call me that was very confused about some of the compliance dates for the safety plans. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page and review that once again. I am briefly and very briefly going to talk about response actions, lockdown, lockout, and those kind of things. Once again, I know you're familiar with that. I'm not going to really spend much time on it, but those things are now changing in the face of coronavirus. So we do need to spend a little time on that. I do want to talk about the emergency drills because this seems to be an area where there's a lot of confusion in differentiating between requirements under state education department law and requirements under the state fire code. So I want to go through that and make sure everybody's clear. And then lastly, I want to talk about new legislation that's going to become effective on April 1st. This is the labor law that'll actually affect education law and very specifically affect what we have to do with our district-wide school safety plans and the changes that we're now going to be required to make in those plans to respond to any communicable disease. So that is the plan for what we're going to cover in the next hour. Next slide. So once again, you should all be familiar with the two major safety plans that are already required under the SAVE legislation. Number one, the district-wide school safety plan, the overarching plan for the entire district, the plan that's required to be posted on your website every year, the plan that is actually there for the public to view. As opposed to the building level emergency response plan, this is the plan that's very specific, tells us the real nitty-gritty about what happens at the building level, how we respond to emergencies. This is the plan that is confidential. So this is the plan that we do not share with the public. They cannot foil this plan. It is a private plan. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I just wanted to set the stage. These are the two major plans. And the plan that is going to be affected specifically by the new legislation under the labor law is the district-wide school safety plan. Next slide. So I just want to briefly go over the regulatory requirements around the SAVE legislation. And obviously, I'm not going to go through everything you see on the left-hand side of the slide, but I wanted you to be aware the SAVE legislation is probably the most comprehensive piece of legislation in the country dealing with violence prevention in schools. And as you can see, it has 16 different components covering many, many things above and beyond the safety plans. It deals with how we report violent incidents in schools. It deals with fingerprinting, child abuse reporting, court notifications, teacher discipline, a whole host of things which we're not going to get into, but it is a very, very comprehensive piece of legislation. But what I did want to focus on specifically is requirements for the safety plans. So one of the best things to come out of the SAVE legislation, as opposed to what was required in previous years under previous legislation, is that we're now requiring, or as of 2000, 2001, there's a requirement that the safety plan had to have community input. We wanted input from as many individuals and entities within the school community as possible. So we wanted that bottom-up development. This was a change from what was previously in legislation where typically someone in the school district, it could be a business official, a facilities director, or the superintendent, could go into a room somewhere, sit down, write a plan, excuse me, and on paper it was compliant, but it never got shared with the school community, and there was never any real input from anyone in the school community. With the SAVE legislation, now that aspect was dealt with, and it actually requires all this community input. So bottom-up development was very important. However, if it doesn't at the same time have top-down support from the school board and the superintendent of schools, we all know it's not going to work. So for all our intentions and for everything we put down on paper and everything we say we're going to do, if it doesn't have support from the top, and if every administrator who's trying to carry out what's in the plan isn't supported by top administration, it won't work. So these are two vital components that I just want to point out to you. But as you look at the actual breakout of what is required under the legislation, you can see that the Board of Education is now required to designate what's called the chief emergency officer. That is typically the superintendent of schools. However, the superintendent of schools can designate someone else within the school district to fill in that capacity. But the superintendent of schools, and when you report, when you go into the portal to report, is typically the person that's designated as the chief emergency officer. The Board of Education also appoints the district-wide school safety team. This is that comprehensive safety team that has widespread community participation. The major focus of the district-wide school safety team is to create the district-wide school safety plan. The plan that we're going to talk about a little later, that's going to be changing. But that is their major focus. They're the ones that are required to actually develop the plan. It cannot be one individual, the business official, superintendent, or anybody else sitting in a corner somewhere, developing the plan, and then making it public. It has to be done by the team. If you drop down one level to the building, at the building level, we all recognize the principal is the incident commander in the building, and the building principal is required to appoint a building level emergency response team. The building level emergency response team is very similar to the district-wide team, only they're doing the same thing at the building level. This is also a comprehensive team of representation, and their purpose is to develop the building level emergency response plan. And again, I'm going to say to you, it can't be someone up in administration developing the plan, sending it down to the principal of the building. That is not the way it's supposed to happen. And if you do it that way, when you're audited or when you submit your plan to the state, it's going to be kicked back to you because they're going to pick up on that. And it's not going to be acceptable. So the building level team, as a team, has to create the plan. Now, something that everybody seems to forget about is you look down to the bottom of the slide, the building level emergency response team also has responsibility for appointing two other teams. The emergency response team, which is different than the building level emergency response team in that they're the action team. The building level emergency response team is the planning team that creates the plan, as opposed to the emergency response team that is the action team. These are the individual, core group of individuals, 3, 4, 5 people that take charge in the building during any emergency. Does that exist in each one of your school buildings? In addition, they're required to appoint a post-incident response team. This is a team that is very, very confused within the districts. They don't seem to always know what the purpose of this team is. This team is there specifically for the medical and psychological aftermath of any emergency. That is their purpose. And certainly during these times right now with coronavirus, there is a tremendous psychological impact on everyone in the school community. This is a team that right now should be meeting and talking about the psychological impacts and how they're going to address that in the school building, right? So very, very important that we recognize that. Okay, next slide, please. All right, I mentioned to you that there's some important compliance dates. These are the dates that are most critical. And once again, I mentioned early on that I just had a business official call me yesterday that was very, very confused, didn't recognize that by September 1st, that the school district-wide safety team was required to review and approve the district-wide safety plan, and then it had to be adopted by the school board after a 30-day comment period. For some reason, this business official thought that was October 1st. It's not. The plan actually has to be approved by the district-wide safety team and adopted by the board after 30-day comment period. That has to occur by September 1st. The building level emergency response team is much the same. They have to review and approve the building level plan, and that gets reviewed by the board and also approved by September 1st. Keep in mind now, I said earlier that the building level plan is a confidential plan. To you, that means that when the board is reviewing the building level plan, they're doing that in closed session. They do not do that at a public meeting. But either way, they have to approve and adopt both the district-wide plan and the building level plan, all by September 1st. By September 15th, training has to be accomplished, multi-hazard school safety training for students and staff. Everyone has to get this training. And in the portal that you go into to submit your plans, there's actually a section where you will now have to show that you've done this training. So that training has to be done by September 15th, and it has to include components on violence prevention and mental health. Now, to me, the simplest way to do that is every year before September 15th, as we open up schools, I would actually have a session with students and staff, and I would review the safety plan. I would review the safety procedures that are in your plan at the building level. That will suffice for the requirements of meeting multi-hazard school safety training. You also, as I mentioned, have to do something on violence prevention and mental health. Well, who did I say were our experts just now on mental health? Our post-incident response team. They should be brought into the mix, and they should be part of the training that's provided on the mental health and violence prevention issue. They're the experts in those areas. So between a principal going through what's in the plan, emergency procedures and requirements, and your post-incident response team picking up and talking about violence prevention and mental health, you could easily accomplish this, whether you're doing this in person or online. All right, but it has to be done by September 15th. By October 1st, you're all well aware that you have to have your plans, your building level emergency response plans into the New York State Education Department portal. That has to be in there by October 1st. Don't be confused, last year and previously, that had to be October 15th, but that's been revised. That now has to be done by October 1st. So you advanced me, send me back. Thank you. So that has to be accomplished with the building level plan by October 1st. Now, additionally, you have to have your district-wide school safety plan posted on your website by October 1st. That also used to be October 15th, but now you have to accomplish that by October 1st. And once again, in the portal, you'll now be required to actually attest to the fact that you've posted it by the compliance date, and they'll actually ask you to give the URL and specific location on your website where it is posted. So that should have all been accomplished by now. You are required to file your building level emergency response plan with local law enforcement and the state police. Now, when you put your building level plan into the portal, that meets the requirement for filing with the state police. It does not currently meet the requirement for filing with your local law enforcement. So that is something separate that you have to make sure that you still accomplish. Now, the first bullet under October 1st is something that has actually been in effect for a long time. This is not something new. We've always been required to provide written information to all students and staff about emergency procedures by October 1st. That has been always required, but it's something, for whatever reason, that a lot of school districts seem to be unaware of. So you should have a document that actually outlines your emergency procedures, and that needs to be distributed to all students and staff. Okay, next slide. All right, I'm not going to talk about the actual response actions other than to show you that these are the typical response actions. And whenever we have an emergency in the school building, we really only have one or two options. We either decide to stay in the building or leave, and that equates with sheltering or evacuation. If we decide to stay in the building, we could lock down, we could lock out, we could shelter in place, or we could hold in place. If we evacuate, we can evacuate on-site, off-site, or we could initiate a go home. That is the essence of how we respond to emergencies in school buildings. But if you take a look at those two pictures I have at the bottom of the page, it's clear that in these times of coronavirus, that we cannot do things in the same way that we always do things. So if you look to the left side, you see something there where we're showing what a typical lockdown situation would be in a classroom where students huddled together very close. Obviously, these are times we cannot do that. We're going to talk a little more about this as we go forward, but that would not be a scenario that you're looking at that we could accomplish in these times. If you look on the right side, you see a typical evacuation. Once again, kids too close, too jammed together. This is not the way we would conduct an evacuation in the current times. And again, we'll talk in a little more detail about that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to talk about the emergency drills and make sure that this is something that is very clear to you. And, by the way, as I'm going through this, I know we'll have an opportunity to answer questions, but if you have questions as we're going along right now, if you put them into the chat, I will see them and I can pick up on them as we go. As long as I don't have too many at one time, I'll try to answer those questions as we go along. So it might be more relevant to try to ask those questions as we're proceeding through the presentation. So feel free to enter your questions in the chat. So for emergency drills, we have two separate things that we have to consider. We have to consider that we have drills that we're required to conduct under Education Law, Section 807, and then we have drills we're required to conduct under the Fire Code, Section 405. And we're very familiar with the Education Law 807, where we have to conduct 12 drills within the course of the school year from September to June. And we also should know that 8 drills have to be done before December 31st. Now, once again, be cognizant of the fact that previously that compliance date was December 1st. You now have until December 31st to complete those 8 drills. And 4 of the drills have to be lockdown drills, and 8 of the drills have to be evacuation drills. How you decide to space those out over the course of the year is up to you. But you still have to conduct 8 of those drills, however you decide to space them out, before December 31st. In addition, you are required to do 2 evacuation drills in the summer months in the first week of summer school. So that's what's happening under the Education Law. However, we have an additional requirement in the New York State Fire Code. And that requirement says that we have to do an evacuation drill every single month. So every single month of the year, January through December, you have to do at least 1 evacuation drill in every building. Now, this is a departure from what we've been used to previously, where a lot of principals will say to me, well, you know what, January and February are tough months during the winter to do these drills. And so I'm going to, jam all my drills into the later months, into the warm months of the year. You can't do that. You have to do at least 1 drill every single month, 1 evacuation drill. So that's something I want you to be clear on, and I'm going to talk to you about that in more detail in the next slide. But now, with coronavirus, we have something new happening, that we have split schedules, we have cohorts, and questions are being asked now are, well, with these requirements, how many drills do I have to do? Do I have to do drills for every cohort? Do I have to do, if I have a split schedule and I have some in Monday and some in on Tuesday, do I have to do the exact number of drills for each one of those? We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. All right. So this is something, and yes, someone just asked, will the slides be available after the presentation? Absolutely. We'll make this entire presentation available to you. So, and this is a particularly important slide because there seems to be a tremendous amount of confusion on the difference between Education Law 807 and the Fire Code Section 405. So if you look to the left side of the Education Law, as we just talked about, so in the 2021 school year, when we're asked to report on this, they're going to be asking us to report on the previous school year. So if you look to that previous school year, we know we have to do 12 drills. I just said 4 lockdown drills, 8 evacuations, with 8 happening before December 31st, the 4 remaining happening between January and June, and then the 2 over the summer. Okay, so that's the requirement. But at the same time, keeping in mind, under the fire code, we have to do an evacuation drill every month. So let's just think about this for a minute and the different ways this may actually play out. Suppose you're a principal and say to yourself, all right, I know I have to do 8 drills before December 31st. I'm going to do 4 evacuation drills and 4 lockdown drills in September. And I don't have to do any more for the rest of this calendar year. So that would technically, under the law, be acceptable. You could do all 8 drills, 4 lockdowns, 4 evacuations in September, and you would be done and met that piece of the requirement. However, that would leave October, November, and December as months where you did not do an evacuation drill. So now what you will have is the 8 drills you did in September, the 3 evacuation drills now required to be done in October, November, and December. So that's actually 11 drills that you'll have completed through December. Now we jump into January. You have 4 remaining drills. Well, you have done your lockdown drills for the year, so you don't have to do any more lockdown drills, but you do have 4 remaining evacuation drills. So let's say I decide, well, for the sake of education law, I don't want to do those 4 drills in the cold weather. I'm going to take all 4 of those drills and I'm going to do them in June when the weather's nice. Well, okay, you could do that technically under the education law, but you would still be required to do an evacuation drill January, February, March, April, and May. So that would mean you've got the 4 drills you did in June, the 5 drills, 9 drills there, the 11 you did from September to December, you'll have done 20 drills. And now you still have to do the 2 evacuation drills, July and August. So depending on the way you decide to do this and space it out, you could do anywhere from 16 drills to more than 16 drills, but you will always be required at a minimum to do at least 16 drills through the school year if you include the 2 done over the summer. All right? So that is the minimum in any school year that you'll be able to do, the minimum. All right? And again, if anybody has any questions on that right now, please chat in. I'd be glad to address them because I know this is a very confusing concept for many individuals. And again, if you have questions at the end, if you want to ask then, we could review it at that point in time. All right. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so I talked about now with coronavirus, clearly we have to do our drills a little differently. So there was a letter that came out from the State Education Department in September that modified or gave some guidance on how we were to modify our drills. So if you look specifically at the evacuation drills, one of the things they said that, well, you could stagger by classroom, and you could send groups out instead of sending everybody out at one time or sending an entire floor out at one time. So you could break that up any way you want to do that to allow for social distancing. And again, when we say social distancing, what are we saying? We're saying that there's an expectation that we're going to maintain at least 6 feet between individuals, and we do expect them additionally to be masked. So that should be the nature of the way an evacuation drill takes place. It is required that at the time of the drill, when you're doing the drill in the building, that everyone in the building at that point in time must participate. So you can't say, I'm going to do the first floor today, and in my split schedule on Wednesday, I'm going to do the third floor or the second floor on Wednesday. Everybody that's in the building at the time has to participate. So that is one thing that is clear. And all students must receive instruction for any educational model. So what I'm saying to you is that it really doesn't matter whether everyone's back in the classroom and that's the way you're currently operating, whether you're operating on a split schedule that you're in 2 days a week, you're out 2 days a week, or whether you're totally remote. Regardless of your educational model, all students are still required to receive instruction on emergency procedures. So again, even when they're totally remote, they have to receive instruction on emergency procedures. Okay? Now, here's the interesting piece. If you look at that fourth bullet under modifications to evacuation drills, this is some very specific language. And so this specific language says, drills should provide all students the opportunity to participate in drills while they are in attendance in person. New students are a priority. So there have been a lot of different interpretations of this, but what the interpretation apparently is at this point in time, and as we go through coronavirus, is that you are not necessarily required to do drills for every cohort. You are not necessarily required to do drills for split sessions. So what I'm saying to you is that if you're on a Monday, Wednesday schedule, if you did the drills with those individuals on the Monday session, and you didn't do it with the students on the Wednesday session, that would technically be acceptable. What it additionally says is that just doing the drill and not necessarily meeting what we just talked about, all the particular requirements, such as, let's talk about the 4 lockdown drills that are typically required in the school year. So if you did with your split schedule on Monday and you did 1 lockdown drill for that group, technically under this new guidance, that will be acceptable for the school year, all right? Or if you did 1 drill for one group and you did three drills for the other group, that would be acceptable. So again, it just was meant to give you, in these very difficult times, a little leeway to do these drills and not make you crazy. But that said, I'm also just going to say to you this. although you may have the leeway now to not do drills for every group, I really don't want to lose sight of the fact of why we're doing these drills to begin with. And we're doing the drills so all school students and staff for that matter have the opportunity to really practice this. And even though for this school year, should we continue in this coronavirus setup, even though it might be acceptable for you to only do one lockdown drill for any particular group, is that what you really want to be doing? So what I'm saying to you is it's really in your hands to make a decision on what makes sense for you in this particular school year, if times stay as they are, and how you do your drills, but you do have a lot of latitude that you never had before. If you move down to lockdown drills a little different in that we're typically used to gathering in that corner and going through a whole process where we jam kids very close together, and we obviously can't do that in the new world right now. So there are a number of things you could do. These are some of the suggestions: that you could drill in a classroom setting while maintaining social distancing and using masks. I'm not sure how you do that unless you're talking about, well, I only have 5 or 10 kids in the classroom. Maybe in that kind of setup you could. You could drill on a staggered schedule, but once again, there'd have to be a very small number of students that are in the room. What really makes more sense is that whatever schedule you're on and whatever number of students you have in the room, that you provide them with an education of what needs to take place during the lockdown drill. So you actually go through the process with them verbally without actually moving them from their seats or from their desks. That would also be acceptable if you decide to do it in that manner. Okay? But we're not doing the typical hiding and sheltering the way we would do in a normal situation. But once again, with that said, I still want to make it clear that if a real emergency were to present itself, and this needs to be part of your instruction to students, that a real emergency, all bets are off, and we would do what we normally do. So a real intruder in the building, we are going to go into our standard lockdown mode and do all the things we do. If it's an evacuation, once again, we're going to go into our standard mode and do what we normally do if it's an actual emergency situation, right? That's something very important for staff, particularly to recognize. If we know it's a real emergency, they have to be clear, social distancing is no longer a priority, right? So we have to make sure we get that point across. Oh, and once again, another thing that kind of gives you a little leeway, because you may have current educational models where you have no students in the building at all. It will be acceptable to conduct your drills with the staff that are in the building at that point in time and meet requirements for actual conducting of drills. So you don't necessarily have to have students in the building if you're in a remote model, if you have staff in the building. Obviously, if you have no one in the building, you're not going to be conducting drills, right? And we had that situation in March and April and in that period of time. And when you go to fill out your forms for next year, you will actually put that in that some of your buildings were vacant, and so you did not conduct those drills at all for that particular reason. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so now I want to talk to you about what I mentioned earlier, this new requirement, the New York State Labor Law, Section 27C. So New York State labor law is requiring everyone and all businesses to meet certain requirements in the event of any communicable disease occurring. And this, without question, is a direct response to what has happened to us this year. So it amends the education law, section 2801A, and for those of you that remember, education law 2801A deals specifically with the district-wide school safety plan, okay? And it amends the district-wide school safety plan to now basically say that the requirements that the Labor Department is now putting on all businesses and entities out there during any communicable disease situation extends to schools, and the requirements that we'll go over shortly have to be addressed in our district-wide school safety plan. Now, initially, and I want to be very clear on this too, when this law came out, it was supposed to be effective within 30 days, which made it effective in October. So you would have had to have this done by October. And many of the attorneys that are giving guidance out to school districts right now are saying that the effective date has passed and you're already out of compliance. I want to make it very, very clear to everybody that is not true. The legislation was revised, and this does not become effective until April 1st, 2021. So be very clear on that, regardless of what you may be currently being told by your school district council, the effective date is April 1st, 2021. But I will say to you, although that seems like that's a long way away, keep in mind, anytime we make any major modifications to our district-wide school safety plan, it once again has to be reviewed and approved by the district-wide school safety team, and it has to be adopted by the board after being out for public comment for 30 days. So that already takes a month away from you in planning to meet this April 1st, 21 deadline, all right? One thing that they do make clear in the legislation, that as you're developing this and going through this, the bargaining units have to be part of the process. If you have an employee handbook, it actually has to be published in the employee handbook, and it has to be posted on the website. Well, that's not a problem for us because we already post our district-wide plan on the website. So that's something we do anyway. I will also mention to you that I am working for all the Nassau County school districts, the 56 school districts here in the county, to develop this plan. I'm going to take their current district-wide plan, include the requirements that we're going to review in one moment, and adopt them into the district-wide plan. When I have that finished, if anyone would like a copy of that, I would absolutely be willing to share that with anyone that's interested. So you can contact me. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are the actual 6 requirements under the labor law that we will now have to adopt into the district-wide safety plan. And so there has to be a designation of essential employees and contractors. So that now has to be put into your plan. It's a list of the actual positions and titles that will be considered to be essential in the event that, as took place back in March, April, we're suddenly required to have a reduction in the workforce. So should that happen again, we now have to have within our plan a description of all those titles and positions that are essential to our operation. And of course, those that do not or are not, and those that can telecommute. And that's point number 2, telecommuting protocols. For those individuals that are considered non-essential, okay? And keep in mind, this is a very touchy issue. When we say you're not essential, we're not saying you're not essential to the operation. Everybody is essential to our functioning in the school district. What we are saying is that the essential people are the individuals that are required to be on site. The non-essential are the people we've determined that, while still is vital to our operation, they can actually operate remotely. So make sure as you're talking to your school employees, you're posing in that way, not to give anybody the impression that, you know, someone is not essential. Everybody technically is essential. They're just essential in different ways. But that's what they're looking for under the law, that who is essential to be on site and who can work remotely. So we're going to have those things in place. Number three, bullet number three, how are we going to reduce overcrowding through staggered work schedules? Again, much the same thing as we looked at in March and April, that how do we reduce overcrowding and still manage to operate? So in the building that I'm in here, we have about 120 individuals that are typically in this building. We managed to, between remote individuals and staggered schedules, we had no more than 30 people in this building at any given point in time. That is the kind of thing they'll be looking for as part of your plan. They'll also be looking for personal protective equipment. You will have a requirement to provide personal protective equipment for certain individuals, and different types of personal protective equipment. So let's say the typical staff member, teacher, administrator, you might be required, or you are going to be required, to provide some type of respiratory protection, some type of face covering. And there's something in the legislation that whatever type of personal protective equipment that you are providing, you're going to have to provide it at least in duplicate. So if you're saying that I'm giving each staff member a cloth mask for when they come into the building, you're going to have to provide them with at least 2 of those, okay, at a minimum. That's going to be a requirement. But let's look a little beyond that to the individuals, such as our healthcare personnel, school nurses, that would be required to have things like N95 respirators. So now you have to make plans to make sure that you can procure and have in storage enough of these to provide them when the emergency occurs. And unlike what happened during this particular emergency, you won't be caught short, and you'll have those N95s in stock. So that's important. Keep in mind too, anyone that you're giving an N95 respirator to, they have to be fit tested and medically evaluated. So be clear on that. If you're giving someone an N95, they have to be fit tested and they have to be medically evaluated to be able to use those. Now, I just want to mention, there was a point during March, April, May, and even beyond that, that we were purchasing KN95s because we could not get N95s. So that was the only thing available to us. KN95s are not the same as N95s. They're the next step down. They're as close to an N95 as we can come, but they're not an N95. And the nature of a KN95 makes it impossible to fit test. So while I said to you, for the N95s, fit testing and medicals, if we find ourselves in that situation again, where suddenly we just can't procure N95s, and we have to buy KN95s, the KN95s are not required to be fit tested. They do not have the same kind of seal that will allow us to successfully fit test them. Another requirement is that we be very involved in the contact tracing. Now, we've already been required under all our reopening plans to detail out how we work with our local health departments, how we respond to individuals that come up as positive for coronavirus in our buildings, how we deal with the individuals that they may have come in contact with. We already have that in our reopening plans. So it should be rather easy to actually translate that over into your document. Okay, but that's something they're going to want in there also. And then finally, and this isn't something that applies so much to us, but collaboration with local entities to identify emergency housing. So as you might remember, during the height of coronavirus, we had a lot of healthcare workers in the hospitals that literally were living at those hospitals. They were not traveling home for a number of reasons. Number one, to make them more available, but number two, to make sure they weren't leaving the hospitals to actually infect other individuals in their own homes or other areas they may travel to. So a lot of the hospitals either set up housing within the hospital or nearby through arrangement with a local hotel or motel and actually provided emergency housing. That really shouldn't be too much of an issue that applies to us. But this is the general essence of what is required under the labor law and the six points that we're going to have to address in the district-wide school safety plan. Okay, next slide. Right, that is everything that I wanted to cover with you. And I guess I planned this perfectly because I'm 2 minutes away from 10:25, where we're going to open up for questions, but this gives us a few more minutes to open it up to questions right now. And so I'm starting to see some of the questions coming up. And I'm going to take the first question. It says, if you have days off with no students, but staff in attendance, can drills be done on those days? Yes, technically the answer to that question is yes, all right? You would technically, under the current situation and guidance, be able to do that. Another question, do we know what education law decided? Do we know why education law decided conflict fire concerning drills? Do we know why fire education law decided conflict fire concerning drills and requirements? Okay, I'm not totally clear on the question, but I think the question is why are we having this conflict between the state education law and the state fire code? And the answer is that, you know, I've spoken to both sides. I've spoken to the individuals that are at the state education department that enforce the education piece, and I've spoken to the individuals that enforce the fire code piece. And they don't really feel there is any conflict because they feel, well, listen, we're just saying to you that you have, regardless of what's required in the education law, you just have to make sure that you're doing an evacuation drill every month. And I guess what they're further saying is that very often we did have principals that were deciding, you know, I might not choose to do my evacuation drills in December, January, and February because those are the cold months. So I'm not going to do it in those months. And their take on that is, well, that's not something we really want to happen because the reality is we could have a situation in any of those months, and regardless of the cold or the snow or anything, you still need to have a plan in place on how you're going to evacuate the building. So that is the take, and so they don't feel there's a real conflict. And I agree, I don't think there's necessarily a conflict. What I think is that it wasn't presented or made known to the school districts in an appropriate manner. They seem to get hit by surprise on this particular issue. So I think it could have been related much sooner and much better. Okay. Okay. Okay, so one of the questions is, if you've gone up and you put in dates that are wrong, how do you change them? You can send a letter, an email, indicating that you have entered dates that were wrong, and then they will allow you access in to change those dates and correct those dates. Next question is, and this is a very interesting question, is there any modification to the early dismissal drill? Well, you know, quite honestly, that's not something I've seen addressed at all. So I haven't seen them address the early dismissal drill, but that is something that, once again, I think you can address. You know, you could do it pretty much in the same manner that you're currently doing it. The only difference is going to be, once again, when you're evacuating the building, you know, you're going to have to do it in a staggered manner. You're not going to let everybody evacuate all at once. So that is going to change that. But that is a very good question, which I hadn't really even thought about myself, that I'm going to also ask the question. We'll certainly get you a direct answer on that. But once again, I think the answer is that, yes, you will be required to do that, but you're going to have to do it in a staggered manner to avoid the individuals coming together in groupings that are of concern. Okay, let's see where we're at. I think we have 2 minutes left. Do we have any other questions on anything we talked about?
Peter, it looks like you've covered all of the information in such depth and clarity that there are no additional questions. So unless somebody has one, we'll leave it open for another. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say that, because again, there's a lot of information to consume in a short period of time. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. It's P. LaDuca, PLADUCA @NASBOCES.org. Please feel free to email me. You can also feel free to call me at any time. Area code 516-396-2388. I would be glad to speak to you at any time.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your time and expertise shared this morning. We really do appreciate it. Everyone in attendance, there is another round of concurrent sessions. Head back to the auditorium and select your session and enjoy. Thanks again and have a great day.
Thank you.